Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to the podcast. Today we have Laura Deming, the founder of the Longevity Fund, which is the leading venture fund focused on longevity. And Laura is one of the most passionate advocates of longevity startups and biotech startups in general, and has some really cool programs she's working on that we'll talk about a little bit more in the program. But thank you for joining us, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So wanted to cover a few things today. I wanted to talk about you and your fund, wanted to talk about a couple areas of longevity research, and then just wanted to talk about the process of starting a biotech company, why someone would do that versus working in academia. And then for those who are starting companies, and we could talk about maybe a couple tactical challenges that you may face and how to navigate those. But first, it'd be great to just hear about you and the Longevity Fund. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I have a somewhat unconventional background in the sense that I was raised in New Zealand as a homeschooled kind of free-range kid. When I was fairly young, I became interested in aging. It just seemed like one of those Odyssey-level tasks that, as a kid, if you want to do something epic, you could go after, and for a lot of different personal reasons, was meaningful to me. When I was 12, emailed someone who changed my life, Cynthia Kenyon, to ask if I could come work in her lab, or if I could come visit her lab more specifically, and then later converted to her being open to me working there. She really changed my life. That led to me being able to do work in a lab early with a tiny nematode that we'll talk about more later called C. elegans, where we would mutate or starve it, or in extreme cases, laser their gonads off to make them live longer, which actually does weirdly work for that species. And then went to MIT fairly young, dropped out age 16, moved to the Valley and started a aging venture capital fund, as one does in their teenage years. And kind of since then have spent the remaining decade, I think, in a couple different ways. One is helping sort of elucidate for me, myself personally, what aging means, what a good framework for the field looks like, and investing in companies that kind of fit some theses in that framework. I think a second thing for me was figuring out how the biotech industry worked. It was really, really confusing as an undergrad to try and understand this industry that had very few relevant textbooks or things you could read about it. And so just getting more information there. And then I think lastly, coming to conviction around a few key theses about, I think when you're in undergrad, you think, oh, like everything is so broken. There's no drugs that are made that are good. And you get in the industry and you realize there's a lot of really smart people doing good work. And it's not just that everything is terrible. But I think there are a few key things that are broken or will be changed in the coming years. And so kind of getting conviction around those and then trying to help spin up programs and educational resources to address them.
Yeah, that's a lot, and that's super interesting. And there's a lot of things I wanted to touch on within that. But first of all, so you were interested in longevity at a very young age, obviously, and before a lot of other people became interested in it. So it's been a very sort of popular area of investing in startups the last few years. But for you, it seems more like a true lifelong passion. So how did you get interested in that in the first place?
Well, I was, to be clear, I think the theme of my life has been sort of being decoupled from what the prevailing interest in a field is. And I think when I was a kid, it was just very obvious, like death seemed like an obviously bad thing. And I now have much more nuanced kind of philosophical views on death, I think, that are informed by being an adult and having more perspective. But at the time, it just seemed like death was the ultimate enemy. We had to fix it. Making aging drugs was the best way to do that. And I was just confused about why there weren't everyone working on this space, why it was such a small field seemingly. And I remember Googling and being like, well, there's like Cynthia Kenyon and Aubrey de Grey, and like who else in the field exists? And so that just seemed like the most epic quest you can go on as a young person to try and reform that. And yeah, so that was the rationale there.
Yeah, that's really, so basically kind of like what Elon Musk, it sounds like, where he says this huge problem that is like existential and no one's working on it. And yeah, death is obviously, the whole biotech industry is really oriented around delaying death or improving quality of life, but not really taking it head on. So to take on that challenge as a young person and devote your life to it, and then 10 years later, or however long later, to see that you're actually making progress and really kind of shaping how we think about that field, it's pretty amazing. So it's a really awesome story, and there's probably a lot more we could get into that on this podcast, but I think it'd be great to hear more about the things you mentioned about how you've evolved your worldview on longevity research and sort of define the scope of the field you'd like to work within.
Yeah,
And then how that meshes with how you've evolved your worldview on the biotech industry and how that fits in with how you want to tackle longevity research as well.
yeah, definitely. So I think the aging field is confusing for many people because there's not currently, if you Google aging, a good framework for understanding the space and the different lines of research. One thing that I found very useful is to have kind of a model that I now have the field, which is two kind of separate categories of intervention. One is basically the thesis that there has been this evolution of pathways that control aging in different organisms, and we can manipulate those pathways in a modular fashion to take advantage of this evolved kind of built out solution to change the rate of aging in different organisms. That's one kind of module. The other, I think, approach is to say, as for example, Aubrey de Great-Sens would, that there's a lot of damage that accumulates in the body. We can kind of figure out what that damage is. We can go after it directly, and that we shouldn't really bother with a lot of these metabolic pathways. There's just stuff that we know we should get rid of that's bad that we can make tools for. I think that there's pros and cons to both of those approaches. I think the pro of the first approach is a lot of our drug development industry right now is built around, Richard, you can agree or disagree with parts of this, but like it's built around targeting pathways like that, where we say what are different kind of holistic pathways that we can go after at certain kind of key switch points, and can we take advantage of biology's complexity, not to act against us, but rather to sort of like act for us, in the sense that evolution has evolved certain modular kind of switches to manipulate, and so that makes that attractive for a kind of what I call a first gen set of longevity companies that are kind of more traditional in scope. I think there's a second gen of longevity companies that we've seen which falls into neither category, which is saying we don't know what to do in terms of the biology, we don't know what to target. We're going to take some way to phenotype aging, so either a cellular phenotype or a blood-based phenotype, and we're going to screen a bunch of different either targets or compounds for their effect on aging. So we're going to take more of an unbiased platform approach to finding new longevity things to do. And that could be either through an evolutionary pathway or just through a compound that you're not really sure what it's doing, but it seems to be helping. I think the whole kind of like third category of going after damage directly is by far the most attractive intellectually. Like it makes sense that if you engineer out a lot of pathologies directly, you have a better understanding and more control of the system. But the problem there really is I think we're limited by our tools. And right now, for example, if I want to knock out like a random like kinase interaction pair in the body, right? Like even that simple, fully spec'd out problem is still something that we can't really do, right? It's hard to get big molecules into a cell. It's hard to target them, specifically to an interaction. And so I think the pro of the last approach is it's intellectually the most appealing, but from a kind of historical standpoint, I think we are still figuring out what parts of that are reachable with the modalities that we have and what parts aren't. And I think the last thing that's very, very exciting for people coming into the field for the first time is, as you would probably talk about a lot, like there's been this recent explosion of modalities of ways to target biology in human with nucleic acids or viruses or cells that is still getting, in the very start, it's very early stages, but opens up the door a lot more to engineer, aging biology in the last way. I think the thing that I've acquired though is that if you look at, for example, the onset of antibodies, like there's kind of decades between the first time that you see a modality and then kind of when it becomes engineerable in a pretty conventional way, maybe more than decades even. And so in terms of predicting when it will be most possible to go after pathologies directly, I think on the last front, maybe that's farther out than we'd like. And so that's kind of why if you look at our fund, for example, we've invested a lot in companies that are traditional in scope, where they're kind of just taking advantage of existing evolutionary pathways, I think to just have a first set of companies out there kind of proving out the field. There's a second set of companies that are investing in that are kind of more platform-esque. And then on the third front, we've done some investing there, and that's what we're most excited about intellectually, but we're still kind of struggling to find the best approaches there that are possible today. And kind of the last thing I'd say is, why should you be in this field today? I think there's an extraordinarily strong argument to that. And it's really not one of those kind of VCBS arguments that, it's like, why should you be doing this today? Let me work backwards from that it is today and figure out the reason why. It's that there's going to be a first trial, I think, for aging directly in humans in this decade. and it could be in the next 5 years, right? We won't see the readout in 5 years, but it could be started and kind of like going in a real way in the next 5 years. There's the TAME trial that your is working on, but just like that is possible means that like some of these efforts that are currently nascent will come to pass. And I think, in the same way that, for example, NASH wasn't a going concern until everyone was like, wait, NASH is the most important thing ever. Let's make all of our companies about like NASH as an indication. I think aging as an indication really has never been taken seriously ever by the industry. And even in our first set of companies, we viewed it as something that you couldn't go after, you had to go after age-related disease. But I think in this decade, for the first time, it's actually going to be possible to run an aging trial. And there are lots of different ways to do that. I mean, one of our companies, for example, is working on doing that in pets, which is it's a whole interesting story. But I think that if and when successful, will be a sea change for the industry. Getting that to happen is kind of one of the most inspiring things you could work on as an entrepreneur, I think, in this space. And so that's why I work on longevity today, because it's the first time to work on this field where you'll see a human fruition of some of these nascent concepts. Now, the last thing actually I'll say is that doesn't mean that you're going to solve like immortality, right? Like I think there's this like equation in people's heads of longevity to, okay, if we solve the problem, that means like we all live forever, right? And that's completely not baked into any of this. Like the only point here is we prove out that this parameter that we take for granted, like number of years alive, is malleable and maybe kind of like changeable in a way that we can continue to get better on kind of, year after year. It's not to say like anything that we'll try in the first pass will give you like infinite life. They'll probably be like years at most, but like measurably statistically significant years that like are quantifiable, if that makes sense. I think that's why it's like a very exciting kind of time to be ahead of that sea change.
No, that's there's so many interesting things there you said as well. I think the main thing I got from that is that you came in as like a teenager interested in this field of fighting death. And then you learn more about the science, you learn more about the industry, you realize what's possible and what's not possible. And you adapted your strategy and developed frameworks to work within, what's available and what's doable in terms of we have these specific modalities that we can use. We have these tools to understand biological pathways. This is what we can do against aging now. But you haven't lost that vision of like, this is the long-term goal. And, these are interim steps along the way. And then it sounds like even now, that long-term goal is getting to be closer within reach. Because for me, my background is mostly in therapeutics. That's where I started. So it's like, here's your disease, like find your target. Like, is this a good target? Like, how are you going to drug it? What's the trial you're going to run? How are you going to get the human proof of concept in like 2 years or whatever? So when I first heard of longevity research, I was like, a longevity clinical trial would take this long and cost this much money. And it's like, how would you even fund that? But yeah. I think that like the fact that there are people like you working in the field, and this doesn't just go for longevity, but for any other of these emerging fields, it constantly forces me to rethink like what's possible and what is a good target to shoot for. So it's really, really cool to see that. And it really kind of forces me and a lot of people to rethink, what's the best thing to be working on right now? What's the best thing to be investing in right now? So the last part you mentioned about this initial trial for longevity potentially starting in the next decade. How did that come about? Can you talk a little bit more about that? And how does that impact your thinking on the space and what you want to be working on?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point in that it's interesting to talk about because just to take it back a little bit, like when I started my first fund, I never thought that I would actually be interested in that specific approach. Like, because everyone, when I entered the industry naively and kind of asked questions about what to do, told me that there was no way you'd ever see an aging trial, that like you should focus on age-related diseases, that story made a lot of sense, it was investable. And so for the first like 5 years, or even maybe 7 years of running the fund, it was just a focus on being conventional VC that was investing in therapeutics that I thought had potential to impact aging because in mice they increased lifespan or because they had these different kind of signals of efficacy in papers, but where I didn't really see a path to us actually seeing that in humans. I think a few things changed. One is that there was just this growing momentum around things like there's one thing called a trial called TAME, which is basically near Barzilai at Albert Einstein College's attempt to measure the effect of metformin on things like all-cause mortality in a very large population of elderly people in a way that would kind of, with FDA's interest, but not total blessing. Like he's talked to the FDA about this. They're like, oh yeah, we're interested in seeing that trial's outcome. That would be something that we might use the information of to change our well, they haven't really committed to anything, but basically they're not like this is totally insane, which is a big step I think for them in this direction. It's just kind of running the first trial to show definitively prospectively that the administration of a drug that is currently commonly quite taken can change mortality, even if just by a little bit. So directly looking at aging, and then maybe trying to work backwards from there to, I mean, as we all know is the most important thing in this field, find biomarkers that allow you to run much cheaper, faster trials, and maybe get some kind of approval off of, but without having to look at all-cause mortality, which is, would be very cool to show, but as a field is not a very plausible thing to have as an outcome. And where you want something that's like cholesterol for heart disease that is an accepted biomarker by the FDA that you can run kind of a trial to look at sort of the different therapeutic effect on. I think what's important to know here is I don't think that TAME trial is the reason to be excited. Like, I think the existence of it is a really cool sort of marker. I think it's more that just increasingly there's kind of clear paths to, like, we're finding more and more drugs that are in clinic, late stage, or already on market that are making mice live longer. When we give them to mice, there may actually be drugs out there that people are taking today, on wide scale that are prophylactic and safe that have these impacts, where again, they're not like magical longevity drugs and they heal forever. They just are changing your mortality subtly. And I can see kind of clear paths from a business perspective to test some of those. And I think there's definitely a leap of faith here that doing an age-related or kind of all-cause mortality trial will result in some kind of change. But yeah, I guess for me, it's just a philosophical shift from kind of viewing that as like, because everyone told me it wasn't possible, like verboten, to now kind of seeing it as like a probable outcome by either a nonprofit or maybe a subtle for-profit means, but just like that it probably will happen, given all the momentum of just like different people also seeing this in the industry and kind of like subtly trying to start doing it. And then kind of asking the question of what happens after that, and how does the industry change overnight? Does everyone take a decade to cotton on? Is it dependent completely on finding a biomarker associated with all-cause mortality? Like, nothing about a trial for all-cause mortality before you find the biomarker really matters. These are questions that I just are interesting to think about, but I wouldn't have the answer to.
Yeah, so basically this is the first trial where you're looking at all-cause mortality, and it's a study where you could potentially find some biomarkers that you could then use to support other development programs that would be sort of surrogates for all-cause mortality without having to run a really long, large study of all-cause mortality.
Yeah, I think to break it down, it's kind of like, okay, if you can show that there exists a drug that impacts all-cause mortality, would proving that point kind of force or maybe induce a regulatory shift in mindset where there was value seen in these drugs in general, where currently, if you kind of talk about the existence of an aging drug, it's seen as hard to classify, like, there's age-related diseases, but there's not aging as a disease. So what does that really mean? And we kind of force the acknowledgement of like a positive effect that could be induced by this class of therapeutic. And then secondarily, could it allow you to correlate things to that and correlate things, not just like that change over age, because you don't know if something decreases with age, whether it's decreasing because, less of it means bad stuff with aging, or whether it's decreasing because like it's bad and to like deal with aging damage, the body's decreasing it, to not have as much of a bad thing. So, you can't equate correlation causation of things like blood biomarkers over time, but you might be able to say if you have a drug that changes a bunch of things in a positive direction that are also correlated with change in their amount over time with aging, and those things, the magnitude of those correlations are linked to a positive shift in all-cause mortality for certain subsets of the population, that might be an interesting kind of set of biomarkers to follow.
Okay, so that would be a way to essentially maybe unlock a lot of other research in the area if people can actually wrap their heads around, like, what does it mean to develop a drug for aging? And then you have this all-cause mortality as sort of your outcomes endpoint, and then maybe you have hints of a biomarker that you could validate, and then people could say, okay, wow, developing a drug for aging could be a thing, and that would be amazing. And now we can have a path potentially between here we are now and developing that drug that fits within our existing sort of clinical development and research paradigm. So is that kind of the hope there?
Exactly. Maybe the concise two-sentence thing would be, we need the acknowledgement of all-cause mortality as a desirable endpoint or thing that you can have. Like, we need the acknowledgement of all-cause mortality as an indication, of shifting as an indication. So just the acknowledgement of that as a disease by the regulatory agency. And we also need biomarkers associated with that are much cheaper and faster to measure, that are accepted by the regulatory agency as proxies for that endpoint for approval before the industry will get excited about en masse developing drugs for its indication. I think once those things are true, you're going to see a lot of capital and effort unlocked towards that.
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of think of it in like FDA language, the label would be like, it's potentially, this drug is indicated to reduce all-cause mortality in X patient population. And if you think about a drug that is approved to reduce all-cause mortality, yeah, that'd be a pretty expansive label, I would imagine. So definitely
Right.
be
And
interested from that perspective. Yeah.
you can argue like it's so expansive that because expansiveness is bad, you shouldn't have that. Like I think you can argue again like that it's weird as an indication, but I think just the sort of desire is to try and get the agencies like acknowledgement enough that like we can get to more specific reasons why that shouldn't be an indication, other than just like it sounds like different than what we've done before.
It's a starting point for a dialogue that previously was not even, people would even consider that was a topic of conversation, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly. And the last thing I'll say, which for people who are not already in the industry might be an important point, is okay, like what, you know, I think everyone coming in from tech always says, well, why do we care about the FDA? Like darn FDA, like just go and, you know, go to some island and like do something there that will, you know, have massive impact. I think the point here is if one company could solve the problem of aging, like that would be amazing. And I think that you'd have to care a lot less about what a certain country's regulatory agency, you know, really cared about subtly in that line. But the goal here is not to do that. It's to have the like hundreds of billions and more importantly, the kind of intellectual mindshare that currently exists in pharma, which is so valuable as a way to make new drugs, convert en masse to being applied towards this line of effort, right? Where right now it's like fine to work on oncology, but you know, until Art Levinson, for example, from Genentech jumped into the aging field, it was seen as a bit kooky to work on aging stuff. But now that he's done that, a lot of people intellectually feel much more safe kind of applying their amazing talents to this area. And I think that's a leverage change we're trying to make here. It's not to solve the problem in one company, although that'd be amazing. It's to get a whole industry to shift and like provide a path for that industry to kind of like unilaterally deploy towards this problem so that the problem like actually gets solved because it's so complex and big, like over the ensuing decades.
Yeah. No, I love how ambitious that is. It's like redefining how you define aging so you can use that as a fulcrum to get all of these really talented people to work on the field. And I think that, I don't know, for me, the reason I love working in this field is because there are so many amazing people in academic science and then working in industry as well, who are just like, I mean, by most definitions, some of the smartest people and best educated people ever to walk the earth who are working on these problems. But yeah, to sort of contextualize some of the stuff we were talking about earlier and also expand on this point is, you know, a lot of the biopharma industry is focused on, you know, oncology, which is great because it's the second leading cause of mortality in the US at least. And then there's a lot of work on rare diseases, which is great because they're very severe diseases. And when you sort of take rare diseases aggregate, like each individual rare disease is by definition rare, but if you put them all together, they probably make up a top 10 cause of mortality. But there's all of these other parts of healthcare that aren't really being worked on. And there's all of these other parts of science that aren't really being worked on. And even within the last 5 years, it's changed a little bit, but if it wasn't like a small molecule or an antibody therapeutic, it just wasn't worked on. Like I remember we looked at like, you know, my fund, like 7 or 8 years ago, we had invested in some like the first gene therapy companies in like the 2000s and they all didn't work. And like you saw a gene therapy pitch in like 2012. Well, some funds, the smarter funds would invest in it, but like a lot of funds, you just didn't even take it seriously. But the idea of taking all these incredibly talented people and just expanding their view of what's possible is, I think, an amazing thing to work on and an amazing goal. And yeah, that's part why I like working with young scientists as well, because I think that they're capable of so much and they haven't really realized what they're capable of yet, in a sense. But yeah. Well, that's super, super interesting. And we can talk more about that later. But I just wanted to talk about the longevity field specifically now, because I know, at least the people who are listening to this, there's probably a lot of scientists who don't work in longevity, but are interested in it. And then there's also probably a lot of people who don't work in science and who are interested in longevity and longevity science as well. And I am also very interested in learning more about it. And you're an expert on it. So I thought this would be a cool opportunity to just kind of pick your brain and have you go through an example of an interesting area of longevity science. So for people who don't know, you wrote a really great blog post that I'll link to on sort of a survey of the longevity field. And you mentioned earlier that, you know, you Google aging research, nothing pops up. So you kind of created your own sort of framework and, you know, schema for categorizing the work in the field, which is pretty amazing. And it's, I think, a good opportunity now to just dig in a little bit more to that. So one of the fields you mentioned was insulin in the IGF pathway. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think maybe, and I should probably have a more concise way to explain this, but I'll try to kind of do just an overview of kind of how I think about aging, and then maybe dive into that pathway specifically. But I think One thing that's kind of not often talked about, I think, with regards to aging, but is to me a key part of the argument for it being malleable, at least in our lifetimes with our current tools, is evolution's impact on it. So I think like if we were, there's an interesting lecture that Yuri Alon gives about modularity, where he, Yuri Alon's kind of like the god of system biology. He gave this lecture series kind of on it, and one paper that he's kind of famous for is he had a set of logic gates that he was trying to evolve a kind of random system to replicate. And when he just tried to evolve a logic gate directly, ended up being a very messy concept. It was like if you changed one thing in a logic gate, it would totally break. Like it was a very kind of like over the place the switches. When he, from an evolutionary perspective, like switched the goal of the system that it was aiming towards every, like X number of generations or so, he would manage to evolve systems that were very modular, where instead of having like a bunch of like very complexly associated pathways, he would have these little modules that evolve functions like NAND or sorry, or is a basic item there, but he would evolve these kind of like mini modules that the organism, in this case, like a sort of logic system, will learn to switch between. And so I think there's if you work in any aspect of biology, you'll see this all over the place, where you'll see proteins have domains that you can mix and match together that have functions. You'll see transcriptional networks that have like little modules in them that can be like linked up with each other. And so I think like a core thing, which is true across all diseases probably, but I mean, just aging, I think it's important to emphasize about why the first approach for aging is, I think, feasible in our lifetime. It's just this modularity that evolution seems to have induced empirically, and betting that modularity is also true of aging. So one thing that people don't often know is Cynthia Kenyon, who's a founder of the field, again, the person that I looked up to the most in the space, was a developmental biologist before she was an aging biologist. And developmental biology, you'll know, is like all about finding these transcriptional modules of what controls like a whole program, for example, a limb to occur, right? And so her thought coming into aging was that she was looking for transcription factors that would control kind of modules of aging biology in a controllable way. And it was that approach that led her to do this experiment and look for, again, there's an early experiment that was done in the 1980s by Tom Johnson and class, which, in a random sort of screening of mutant C. elegans, found a few mutants that lived longer. That was kind of what kicked off the idea that this was possible. But Cynthia's approach was to say, okay, like, is that a developmental program that worms are inducing or not that might be evolved for X reason? And so I think the thing that really blows me away about aging biology, that I think like you have to like understand to intellectually be engaged with it and excited with it, is just that like, okay, like looking for those developmental modular kind of pathways that control aging, we found them. And so that doesn't mean we have to use them to control aging. It just means that like, we know that aging is malleable. Like we've seen it repeatedly, and they translate across species barriers. So in this one example that I'm sort of mentioning here, it's an IGF, Cynthia Kenyon, my old mentor, went through, mutated a bunch of worms to try and find ones that lived longer, and found one mutation in C. elegans that lived about twofold longer than normal. That same mutation, when replicated in its homolog in mice, or it's a complicated pathway, but kind of like a semi-analogous point, the same pathway, increased lifespan by about 60%. So you went from like the first discovery of mutation in that pathway actually being close to 50% in the 1980s, now then 2x in the 1990s, being in the first experiment in mice, or one of the first, about 60% increase, which to me is absolutely insane. Like you should not expect a worm with a couple thousand cells to have this modular aging pathway that in mice increases lifespan to a similar magnitude, right? That is weird. Like nothing about that intellectually to me adds up, except for this idea that there must be some evolutionarily kind of conserved thing that we're affecting there. And again, like that doesn't mean that the aging therapies of 100 years out will be going after modular pathways. They'll probably be much more nuanced and much more engineered. But it means to me that like this is a plausible field to work on. And I remember talking to the head of BD at a major pharma company when I first started my fund, asking him like, how should I think about this field? Like, do you think this is crazy? And this was the head of one of the largest, one of the largest pharma companies around. And what he told me was the reason that his company got into cancer in like the 1980s, it's now one of the most famous companies in that space, was because of the discovery of oncogenes, that there were these genes that controlled cancer, and the idea that like, that didn't mean, again, that like you had to go after those genes specifically, but that cancer is a malleable thing that you could target in a way that humans can understand, which is to go after like, one node and pathway. And to him, like Cynthia's discoveries and, the Tom Johnson discoveries were a similar phenomenon where, okay, now we have aging genes That doesn't mean that those are the only ways to go after aging, but it means that the field is now opened up to a approach that is, relevant to our tools today. Sorry, that's probably like a lot of like spiel, but I think that to me is the core interesting thing that happened in the 1990s that influenced aging biology. It's the discovery of modular conserved cross-species pathways where, the last thing I'll say on the IGF-1 pathway is if you look in humans, people who have mutants of that pathway, there's like one paper on this, have very little age-related disease, in their kind of like almost no cancer in this one kind of paper, despite kind of surviving to a somewhat similar age as their wild type counterparts. And so, we don't know that this pathway, and also a lot of things in dogs, for example, if you look in one species, large dogs live about twofold less than small dogs. And this pathway is all about targeting like the insulin IGF-1 or sort of growth factor pathway where, mutants in the mice that live longer, for example, are dwarfs, like they're Ames dwarf mice. And they live significantly longer than normal, but they're smaller. And in dogs, when you see the same mutation that controls size and development to some respect, although size, the development in the adult phenotype are somewhat different, you'll see that, large dogs live half as long as the smaller dogs. And it's like a very nice correlation across dog size. And it's in that same pathway that we know controls, both size and development and aging. And so there's just kind of like this beautiful, like, if you are in the field and you have read the insulin IGF-1 literature, there's this beautiful body of evidence that like has miraculously conserved its effect across like worms through to like these much more complex animals that have nothing to do in biology with like what you think worms are doing. And I think that's what's exciting to us kind of today is, we don't, some of our companies are trying to develop drugs for that pathway. It's not clear that like that's the best approach, but just that biology exists, I think is just like if you're looking for a book to read on like aging biology to get into it, I think like if someone had written a good book on that, that would be like the best book, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So it's interesting. So you basically, to kind of recap a little bit and bring it back, Cynthia Kenyon mutated all these genes in worms, and she was a developmental biologist. She was studying how human beings develop, and how at a genetic level and a molecular level, different cells become different in different cells and how organs are formed and all that stuff. So there's nodes to control and provide this modularity for developing different parts of your body, different functions, different cell types. And she took that same approach and tested it in worms, found all these genes that were associated with longer lifespan. And then there was a finding that it wasn't just in worms, it was actually also in mammals, in mice. And then that kind of raises this question, like, what's going on here? You have a mouse that lives a lot longer if you mutate this gene, and the same thing happens in mice. And we know that this pathway is incredibly important in a lot of things in humans, and in dogs as well. But like, what underlies this phenomenon, that this gene, this pathway influences aging? It's just not a question that people have asked much, I would imagine, at least when that discovery was made. So then for you, there's probably a series of different genes or modules like this, where it looks like across different species, these genes seem to be sort of correlated with longer lifespan, and maybe they regulate something in the aging pathway. And then the question is, what are they doing and how do you exploit that? Is that kind of the part of it?
Concise summary of my insulin IGF-1 rant.
Okay.
But I think the thing to note also is that this doesn't mean we have to go after those genes. It just means it's a definition of the plausibility and the malleability of aging and how easily we can address that in just like a first set of approaches.
Right. Just like we were able to understand the genetics of cancer and then intervene to change cancer, or even, now with stem cells, we understand sort of from developmental biology how you differentiate different stem cells into different cell types. You can do the same thing, but with that goal being lifespan. And so that field is, how far along has it come since those initial discoveries? How much do we know about the IGF pathway and how it influences lifespan right now?
I think it's been a bit hard to figure out the why, as always in biology. It's like, okay, we know that empirically there's a bunch of mouse studies now looking at even antibodies against the pathway given in adult life, and you still see increases in lifespan when the mice aren't dwarfed and you're just looking at adult intervention. So there's been a lot of characterization of that, of different, what tissues are involved. There's an attempt like for a long time to find a key transcriptional factor that was downstream of this pathway that was controlling everything. And so DAF16 in worms, or kind of a FOXP transcription factor in humans, is a candidate for that. but we haven't really nailed down on why. Like we couldn't tell you this one part of the cell gets better, therefore this pathway is an effect, or this one transcription factor is the full reason for the effect. So it's just empirically very much more validated now. But as always in biology, like we don't know like the exact molecular why.
Yeah. Okay. No, it was just kind of my curiosity was getting the better of me. It'd be really interesting to understand how that all works, but it would probably be outside of the scope of this context or the conversation, even if we did know that. So then bringing that back to your work with startups. So you got interested in this field because there were some identification of these tractable biological pathways that were related to lifespan. And then you worked in an aging lab. So how did you decide that starting a fund was the pathway you wanted to pursue to accomplish your goal of improving lifespan?
So it's actually interesting. The first thing I tried to do when I moved out to the Valley was start a different incentive model for how to incentivize academic researchers and venture capitalists to work together, where I had this idea that academic researchers never get the value of their research. They hand off their inventions and maybe they get some royalties, but they're doing such incredible work. If they were better financially incentivized, it would be more fair for one, and also it might kind of make the market for innovation more efficient. I quickly learned that just starting a fund, much less like a fund with a wildly complex and different structure, socially is a challenge unto itself. And so that's why I just kind of picked the simplest possible thesis, which was that more money equals more progress in this field. I think though there was another subtle part of it, which was I was very confused as an undergrad as to how the industry worked. I didn't know how a Nature paper made it to be a drug. And I wanted to understand that process better. I think I now know that there's no one playbook for that, that it's just a very complex industry that's evolving all the time in subtle social ways that aren't necessarily tabulated in any one place. But I now understand it better. So part of it also was just I wanted to understand what the process, what was happening there, and what the blockers were to this happening more. And yeah, so those are kind of the reasons.
Okay, so you were interested in the applied research, less the discovery, obviously, because you wanted to work on this goal of fighting death. And to do that, you needed to bring stuff out of a Nature paper and into the real world. And to do that, needed money and working within some established framework that we use for developing drugs.
Yeah. So at the time, there was this prevalent narrative about valley of death. You read a lot of articles about it where the narrative was that there's a lot of amazing science. There's a valley of death where you need a couple $1 million to go from science to drug, or maybe even longer than that to POC, where someone will fund the rest of the development. And that fixing that valley of death problem was going to, change the nature of early stage kind of biotech, development, and that was the big problem. And I kind of fell into that narrative of, I just need to get enough money that I can fund ideas that are crazy enough, but maybe some of them will work through this valley of death, that then other people will fund them more. And that was the framework that I had at the time.
Yeah, and then it sounds like that theory, I guess, does that theory still hold true? How do you feel about that right now?
Well, I think that's much less true now. I mean, so a couple things have changed. One is money for most biology research. This year has flipped it back a bit, but if we were talking last year, money for most biology, early stage, company formation, that's founder driven, and also specifically for longevity has dramatically increased in the past 5 years. So again, when I started the fund, there was no money for longevity at all. It's hard to describe how not a field it was. Now it's a field that people have conferences about, where venture capitalists kind of want to establish a practice in. It's seen as normal and investable, and that's completely changed the game for money being available for it. I think so. If you want to start a company in the field now, that it is possible to raise money within a year to do it if you just take the right steps and you're a logical, motivated person. And that really was much less true, a decade ago, which is very inspiring and nice. I think the thing that's missing now, and something that I'd love to pick your brain about, online or offline, is founders. So I think when all this money became available, the question was, where should it go? And then we all kind of woke up and realized, holy cow, a lot of company formation traditionally is done by venture capital funds that have in-house staff that they pay to do an excellent job of, spinning up companies and kind of pushing stuff forward. But that kind of is also a rate limiting factor on the number of companies that get started each year. If you are limited with the number of employees at X number of biotech venture firms, and so where are all the other founders that presumably should be arising in response to this influx of capital and interest in kind of the space? And I think it's been interesting to kind of just see how long of a process it can be to grow that ecosystem and to help a lot of incredible people who probably would want to start companies and have the motion to do it kind of learn that they can and should, or maybe that they want to, and give them the tools to figure out what the first couple of years of that should look like. Like I thought that would be a really easy thing once you had the money. And the interesting thing for me has been that it's actually like a very non-trivial ecosystem to start to grow.
Yeah, I completely agree. The money it was a gating factor. And it used to, like 5 years ago, I didn't know whether the sort of the chicken and egg problem, like, do you need more money? Do you need more companies? Like, what's the issue here? And then the money came, and it doesn't seem like the companies have come yet, although maybe there's more companies for sure, but it's not quite the Cambrian explosion that, one could potentially imagine or hope for.
Yeah.
So what do you think, what in your experience have been, like, what are the blockers? Like, what are the obstacles on the path of being a great scientist or being, someone interested in starting a company and actually doing that?
Yeah, so here's the thing that I believe now that I really couldn't have told you I would have a clue about like 5 years ago, or even maybe 3 years ago, which is I used to think that if you just took a really smart person and you gave them a business plan that made sense, and you told them that they should like get over all of their fears and self-doubts and just do it, that they would be able to get started in a month. I just thought that would be like a very straightforward set of things to put together. And I now think being a founder is a much more subtle psychological thing, that it takes a long time to go from, having the idea that you might want to do this to being in a place where you have full conviction, where you're ready to run, where you have all the context required. I think it takes years for a lot of people to take that full journey, and that you can't speed, to some degree, you can't fix that. You can't tell them what they have to do, to have them just like go and do it. Like for some people, it's going to take a long time to learn and get conviction and act, and maybe it's better for them to wait to do it. I do feel like there's probably a lot of ways to speed this up. Like, for example, I think we've talked a lot about this, like that there's not a lot of ways to learn about what to do in the first year of a company or context for the industry that we both drastically want to fix, because that's a major blocker that might turn those 2 years into 2 months. But I think it's one thing. I think the other thing though is just, I have a lot more conviction, like kind of feeling now that it's a psychological thing to become a founder, that you need to feel full conviction around your idea, and that people can trick themselves to think they're there when they're not. And it's a really bad thing to jump into a company before you're completely convicted behind it. And so it's worth taking more time to get there emotionally for yourself before you start the company, than to just jump into it. And really that's come from just watching a lot of these stories for me the past few years. Like 2 years ago, I would have told you, like, you should just, if you know what to do, just go do it. Doesn't matter if you feel like you should do it or not. Like, you just, you need to get over that. And now I just have a lot less, very different approach.
Yeah. People come from very different places, and, not just from like a economic or social background, but psychological background, and have different goals. And what I found is there's an incredible amount of entrepreneurs who are people who are, if they knew what entrepreneurship was and that they could do it, it would be like their calling, right? Like,
totally.
But a lot of them, they don't necessarily know what starting a company is. And a lot of them in the biotech field have heard of, the whole, even like Bay Area universities, they're very familiar with the idea of startups, but they think of it, their exposure comes from like Shark Tank and the TV show Silicon Valley. And then like every once in a while they read some news article about it. So it's like, they don't really think it's like not something that's for them necessarily, or that they could do. And then when people realize that, oh, I actually am like ideally suited to start a specific type of company, let me try it. And then some of them realize, wow, this is like what I've been looking for my whole life. It takes off, but it's not clear to me that you can identify someone who would be like that, or even if you can find someone who might have some of this latent, it has to be something that people can come to and decide on their own. And beyond that, it's not something that can be taught necessarily. Can be learned, but you have to do it yourself, I think. And like you said, there are things you can do to accelerate it for sure. Like the work you've been doing around just mapping the longevity field and the biotech startup space, and some of this work I know Celine has done as well, that can reduce that time frame of like learning about the industry from 2 years to 2 months. And then the best practices around starting a company as well. There's just so many little pieces that are just daunting and hard to do in a vacuum or alone. And hopefully with more information and more sort of a community, people will be able to like take that step. But I think a big problem too is the time it takes in a lot of cases to get there. And if you're a grad student or a postdoc, if you're talented and driven enough to start a company, you could probably work for a big venture fund or Genentech or McKinsey or be a PI. And like, why would you spend X number of years of your life learning about this crazy thing that you may or may not be interested in doing and is super high risk, if you could go and work at a prestigious, well-known, well-paying job that has a lot of impact. So that's something that I've run into a lot with people who are considering starting a company, but it just doesn't get there by the time they have all these other things that they could pursue.
Totally. Yeah. I think, and maybe the last thing I'll say, just because it seems like we're kind of on time, is like basically, and I think you're doing a lot to kind of try and fix this problem, which I think is just so cool. But I think one issue is that there's no like place to go where you're like not seen as being just insane when you try and figure all this stuff out for yourself. Like, I mean, what this looks like for a lot of people today is like leave your job, sit around, be like very confused and upset for like a year or something, and feel like you're failing, and then your whole family thinks you're crazy and you're not making any money, and like you're talking to a lot of people and you feel very fulfilled, and just suddenly at some point you have this like dramatic moment where everything is so terrible and then it, like a light turns on. I mean, that's dramatic. Like, it's not that way. A lot of people have a better version of it, but for a lot of people actually it is this terrifying journey that they have no social support for, that just seems like it's not like something that people do, right? It's like how starting a company used to be like a weird thing and that pressure to do all the time. That actually I think is the case for this part of the journey, where like there's a way to start a company that's like very normal and like, oh, you're an academic that's like spins out a company and it's very nice little kind of like direct, you know, application of your research. That's accepted. But then to go out into the world and try and like do something a bit different is still a really hard like thing to do personally. And so I think like, you know, some of the stuff that you're doing, and like, for example, we're also interested with like Build With Us, I think is the reason that we're interested in that is to help normalize and describe that that is a thing people do, and like put it out into the world that like you know, this is a path you can take, and help normalize it as something that people don't see as like it, not normalize it in the sense like people need to view it as like a generic thing for the best entrepreneurs. Like the best entrepreneurs will do it, you know, one or the other, but help people feel more comfortable going and doing that kind of, you know, still hard journey, and having them understand also that like it shouldn't be easy. Like they shouldn't just leave their job and be like, the next day I know what to do, that it's going to take a long time to figure it out, and that like they just need to kind of fight through it. But like that's part of the process.
Yeah. Yeah. That is that difficult part of figuring out what the best idea is and making it work is necessary. And it can be shorter sometimes, or it can be longer, but you know, you have to go through that. And it's hard, to know that that's okay if you haven't done it before and familiar with the space. And it's hard to communicate to people around you that that's a normal thing, for sure. So I know we're short on time, but you mentioned briefly at the end, is it called Build With Us, that you're the program? Okay.
This is one of the things that I'm most excited about for this year. And it's exciting because it's like the culmination of everything that we've ever wanted to do, but just felt like we shouldn't. And like with the fund, for example, for a long time, we thought, oh, our only job is to scale and to try and get more companies to start. And I think just this year we decided we're just going to do exactly what we want to do, which is we want to work with, you know, 3 to 5 people personally to help start their companies, and just basically like act as co-founders, do everything that we can to help them through this process. We understand a lot about mentally what it takes to kind of go through this journey of like, I don't know what I'm doing at all, so like I now have a company. And so it's like basically us just trying to like be there for 3 to 5 people over the course of a year, which if you think about it is like a massively inefficient allocation of fund resources. Like we should really be doing something different with our time. But to us, this feels like the thing that we would most love to do and enjoy doing, because we just love working with people through this process. And also I think the kind of most useful thing we can do for we're really like not looking for anyone. We're looking for people who we think will be able to change the industry, and really looking for people who we think will build the companies that will, you know, get to the clinic and show the aging POC and change things that way. And we'll do everything we can. We can fund them with, you know, up to $1 million or more. That's available from the fund, you know, to seed. But I think for us, it's more just like committing to work with them for a year throughout the whole process. And that's just something that we're super excited for this year. So sorry, probably like a pretty like decent description, but just that's something that I'm really excited for this year. And I think comes from just like having this feeling that, you know, this is the most important part of the process. It's really not lauded as heroic, but it is kind of like the key part to like the next generation of like great Genentechs kind of coming to be.
Yeah, that's the bottleneck potentially. And if you can remove that bottleneck, then that can unlock all the other stuff that you're doing and make that more scalable as well. So I know you have to run, but is there somewhere people can go to like learn more about the program or to apply, just to your website? Or
w.vc, V as in Victor, C as in capital, is where they should go. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you again for joining, Laura. This was super interesting. Always great to talk to you. And I'll put all the links in the description. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was really fun.